The first tafsir we have a record of came in the year 104 of the Islamic calendar, which correlates to the year 722. This tafsir is called Tafsir Mujahid. This was written roughly 90 years after the death of Muhammad. What's interesting is that it interprets the verse exactly as it's written. All it does is give us more detail on what this spring is. He tells us it's blackened and muddy. So when do Muslim scholars start to tell us that the sun doesn't actually set in a muddy spring? The second one, which appeared 15 years later? No, they still didn't have a clue. How about the third one? No. Fourth? Nope. Fifth? No. Sixth? No. No. Now here at number 11, in chronological order, we have the tafsir of Tabari. It's arguably considered the most credible tafsir of the Quran, and all other major tafsirs like Ibn Kathir, Qurtubi, Jalalain and so on borrow heavily from Tabari's tafsir. What he did was gather together all the narrations he could find that related to any given verse. For verse 1886, Tabari gathers an astonishing 15 narrations from early Islam to describe this single verse. We can see by reading these that all Muhammad's companions clearly took the verse as meaning the sun set into the spring. Their only differences were in regards to the nature of this spring. Most claimed it was black and muddy, some said it was a warm spring, some said it was all three, warm, muddy and black. So Tabari and all the people who mentioned this verse had no idea this wasn't literal. Let's keep checking. Number 12? No. Number 13? No. We now get to number 14, a whole 350 years after Muhammad's death. 350 years. This tafsir is attributed officially to a scholar called Sulaiman al-Tabrani. This is where we get the first hint. It claims Dhul Qarnayn saw it setting into the water because he couldn't have actually reached the place where it set. Now, this is embarrassing enough as it is to all those who claim that the verse meant something other than what it actually says. It took 14 tafsirs and 350 years after Muhammad's death for Muslims to start suggesting it was from Dhul Qarnayn's perspective. But the problem is, this tafsir attributed to Sulaiman al-Tabrani is controversial and largely dismissed as a fraud that was actually written between 500 to 600 years after Muhammad's death. It was written by other people who tried to give it legitimacy by attributing it to Sulaiman al-Tabrani, and Muslims who have investigated this have reached this conclusion, not me. I'll provide a link, albeit in Arabic, to the arguments against this particular tafsir. As this one was widely regarded to have been written way later, let's keep looking. Did the genuine 14th tafsir, 365 years after Muhammad's death, figure out this verse was not literal? No. Number 15? No. 16? No. 17? No. 18? No. The 18th tafsir actually tells us that the muddy spring propels the sun through the underworld to reach the place of sunrise. This shows why an apologist argument fails, which claims that if it set into a spring, it would have needed to have come out from the same spring, and that wasn't mentioned in the Quran, therefore that isn't the case. But what they're forgetting is that it was understood that it was propelled from the west spring through the underworld all the way to the east spring where it rises. But what we also see, more importantly in this tafsir, written by Thalabi in the year 427 of Hijrah, it reveals where Muhammad got this idea from of the sun setting into a muddy spring. He cites a poem by an ancient Yemeni king called Tubba, who lived at least 700 years before Muhammad. The poem was about Dhul Qarnayn. Roughly translated, it says, Dhul Qarnayn was a submitter before me, a king who was adored by kings. He reached the west and east, in roads laid down by the wise guide. So he saw the sun as it was setting in a spring of black mud. We can now see where this story originates from. Is this all some grand coincidence? Is Islam really a hard test of faith? Or is it now simply becoming an easy test of gullibility and stubbornness? Now, the Bible also has a similar verse to this. It says, the sun rises and the sun sets, and hurries back to where it rises. This indicates that the sun rises and sets on the earth's surface because it hurries back to where it rises. Now, granted, this is slightly more vague than the Quran, but it still implies this. Muslims are probably now looking at the Bible verse thinking, yeah, of course that one's an error, but the Quran is perfect, I'm sure that there are answers to everything. Anyway, let's move on and see when the first Muslim scholars begin to understand that the sun cannot physically set here on earth. The 19th tafsir still has no clue, but with the 20th tafsir we finally get there, a whopping 440 years after Muhammad's death. This tafsir actually talks about it being literal, and then says, but there's a second opinion. It may have set behind the watery horizon. The next tafsir, number 21, 450 years after Muhammad's death in the Islamic year 460, which corresponds to the Western year 1067. This tafsir, written by Al-Tusi, explains which clever Muslims eventually figured out the sun was too big to set in a muddy spring every evening. It tells us the Baghdadis eventually figured this out, but there was still dispute. A scholar called Ibn al-Akhshad rejected this new interpretation, despite contrary scientific evidence, saying, and I quote, "No, It does set in a muddy spring, exactly as the Quran clearly says. That was a quote. Again, it pulls the rug from underneath desperate Muslims who today claim that the Quran doesn't actually say that the sun is setting in a spring. They must be smarter at the Arabic language than all Muslim scholars combined in the 450 years following Muhammad's death, who are now getting schooled at classical Arabic by non-Arabs like Zakir Naik. Now, if you're a Muslim watching this video, I hope you are able to see the evidence that this verse did mean the sun sets into the earth is simply undeniable.